The icy fingers of the chilly wind mercilessly tormented Anya's thin body, penetrating her tattered patch shawl and causing her to shiver and tremble with every fiber of her being. The girl, struggling to move her legs numb with cold, trudged along a barely discernible path covered with rotten leaves, which wound deeper and deeper into the autumn forest, gloomy as a wolf's den. With each step, the trees closed in tighter, their bare, twisted branches scratching the low, leaden sky, and the sunlight, already scarce at this time of year, barely penetrated their dense intertwining. Behind her, shrouded in gray stove smoke, lay the village, and in it the cursed hut of Aunt Marfa, her evil, merciless guardian. This morning began with a particularly fierce attack of her aunt's malice. Marfa, not finding in its usual place the last, cherished piece of crushed sugar she had hidden from Anya, the only sweet thing in their joyless home, fell into a real frenzy. Her face, already unattractive with its close-set eyes and thin, perpetually pursed lips, was contorted with rage. Grabbing the first thing that came to hand, a heavy, sooty poker, she swung it at the girl, who cowered in terror with a wild cry. Anechka, accustomed to such outbursts, miraculously managed to dodge, jumping aside, but the ringing, stinging slap still caught her, burning her left cheek and leaving a crimson mark. "Get out of my sight, you snake," Marfa screamed, spraying saliva. "And don't you dare step on the threshold without a basket full of berries, or you'll sleep in the barn with the chickens like a stray dog." Berries? What berries, for heaven's sake? When the first night frosts had already silvered the withered grass, and the trees, as if mourning the passing summer, had almost completely shed their once lush, crimson-gold foliage. But to contradict her aunt, to try to explain anything, was not only useless, but also deadly dangerous. Any word spoken in her defense could only increase her fury. Anya silently, trying not to meet her gaze, pulled her threadbare shawl over her head, picked up the empty wicker basket, which now seemed impossible to lift, and wandered off, wherever her eyes took her, just to get away from this house full of hatred, where, since the day her parents died, she had felt like a stranger, unwanted, a perpetual burden, a free laborer. Her aunt's shrill scream still rang in her ears, and her cheek burned as if a red-hot iron had been pressed against it. The only glimmer of hope, faint and almost ghostly, like the morning mist over the river, were the half-forgotten stories of her late grandmother, Agafia. When she was in a good mood, the old woman would whisper to her granddaughter, looking around, about a strange sunflower. She said that it grew only in the most impassable, deadly swamps, in the terrible black marsh, and that it bloomed only once every 100 years, on the most desolate day of autumn. And whoever managed to find it and pick it, without being frightened by the bog goblins or the wood goblin, would find great happiness. Or else the flower could be sold to passing merchants for such untold riches that it would be enough for a comfortable life until old age. Anechka, of course, did not believe too much in these old tales. But despair, cold and sticky like a swamp, pushed her forward, forcing her to cling to any straw, even the most unlikely. What did she have to lose, after all? Life with Aunt Marfa was little better than a slow, painful death from hunger and beatings. And as if to add to the fear in her already tormented soul, in recent days, the villagers had been talking more and more alarmingly about the Gray One, a lone wolf as big as a calf who, according to rumors, was roaming somewhere in the surrounding forests. They said that he had already killed more than one sheep that had strayed too close, and recently he had even dragged away a heifer from the old shepherd Miki, who had been in a fever for 3 days afterwards. The men, incited by the most zealous and ruthless hunter in the district, Ignat Creevy, were planning a large hunt for Sari, sharpening their blunt pitchforks and checking their old, rusty flintlock rifles, loading them with large buckshot. Ignat, whose face was disfigured by an old scar left, according to him, by a bear's paw, beat his chest with his fist and swore before the whole village that the skin of this forest devil would soon adorn the wall above his stove. The mere thought of Sari made Anichka's blood run cold, and a slight shiver ran down her spine. But her fear of her aunt's imminent wrath and her ghostly, almost insane hope for the magical sunflower proved stronger. She walked, barely seeing the road, stumbling over protruding roots, scratching her face and hands on thorny branches, driven by the icy wind and her own hopelessness. Further and further away from the hated village, into the heart of the gloomy, silent forest, which seemed to reluctantly part before her, as if unwilling to let her into its hidden depths, where salvation and inevitable doom could be hiding behind every tree trunk. The empty basket banged painfully against her thin, bruised legs, but Anya only clutched its rough, time-worn handle more tightly, as if it were her only talisman, her last lifeline in the boundless, stormy ocean of all-consuming despair. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's begin. The forest was becoming increasingly dense and impenetrable. Centuries-old pines and firs, mighty and gloomy, closed over Anaya's head like a thick, prickly tent, almost completely blocking the already sparse, scattered light of the autumn day. The path, if there ever was one, had long since disappeared under a thick layer of fallen pine needles and rotten leaves, and the girl now made her way at random, guided by the sun, which only occasionally peeked through the thick veil of clouds, and by the moss on the tree trunks, as her father had once taught her. She clung to the thorny bushes of wild raspberries and rose hips, which painfully scratched her already wounded hands, and stumbled over the roots of ancient trees hidden under the foliage, which looked like the twisted fingers of forest monsters. Hunger, which had long since become her constant companion, made itself felt with a dull, aching pain in her empty stomach. And her feet, clad in worn-out, wholly bast shoes, buzzed with incredible fatigue. But Anya stubbornly, with a kind of donkey-like persistence, pressed onward. She vaguely remembered that the black swamp, about which so many terrible stories were told in the village, was somewhere here, beyond the old clearing overgrown with young aspen trees, where once, before she was born, her father and other men had cut down trees to build a new church. Memories of her parents, warm and bright as a summer afternoon, flooded her mind suddenly and mercilessly, causing her heart to contract with a sharp, unbearable pang of longing. Mom, her kind, radiant eyes, which always shone with love and tenderness, her gentle, warm hands, which so skillfully swaddled her as a baby and so tenderly stroked her head before bedtime, her quiet, melodious lullabies, to which she fell asleep so sweetly. Father, his strong, reliable shoulders, on which it was so cozy and safe to sit when he carried her around the village, his loud, infectious laughter, which seemed to dispel any clouds. All this, all her childhood happiness, was taken away by a merciless, insidious disease, either typhus or some other contagious illness that wiped out half the village at the time, leaving Anya an orphan in the care of a distant relative. Her quarrelsome, stingy, and cruel Aunt Marfa. Sometimes, in moments of particular despair, the girl thought it would have been better if the merciless disease had taken her along with her parents, rather than live such a pitiful humiliating existence, full of deprivation and abuse. But then she remembered her mother's last words, spoken in a weak, broken whisper. "You must live, Anya, my daughter. No matter what happens. Live and believe. Believe in the good." And she walked on, gritting her teeth. Because now she had nothing left to believe in, except this ghostly, almost unreal sunflower. The last straw to which her mind, drowning in despair, clung. The air around her became noticeably damp, heavy, saturated with the acrid smell of mud, rotting algae, and some kind of stale decay. That meant the swamp was very close. Despite her exhaustion, Anya involuntarily quickened her pace as much as her weakened strength would allow. And then ahead, through the sparse, bare trunks of weeping birches and black, charred-looking alders, she saw a gray, lifeless, dreary expanse covered with a misty haze. This was it. The Black Swamp. A place that even the most desperate and experienced hunters tried to avoid at all costs. The most terrifying rumors circulated in the village. They said that the bog was so treacherous and bottomless that it sucked in unwary travelers in a matter of minutes, leaving them no chance of escape. That at the bottom of this cursed swamp lay the restless souls of those who had failed to escape its deadly embrace, and that at night their plaintive moans and cries could be heard. That it was inhabited by kikimora, water spirits, and other evil creatures, just waiting to lure their next victim to them. But all these horror stories hardly frightened Ania now. Well, they frightened her, of course, but not enough to make her turn back to her hated hut and Aunt Marfa. There was no turning back for her now. Her aunt had made it clear. Don't come back without a basket full of berries. But what berries could be found in the forest at such a late, cold time of year? Only this mythical fairy tale flower, if it existed at all, could be her only salvation, her ticket to a different, better life. She stopped at the very edge of the quagmire, where the ground still felt relatively firm under her feet. And with her heart pounding, she began to peer into the dreary, joyless landscape stretching out before her. Endless mounds covered with withered brown grass and sparse, prickly heather. Rare, stunted, twisted bushes of marsh Labrador tea, exuding a sickening, nauseating smell. Dark, almost black, oily water in the channels, covered with greenish duckweed and a rainbow film of decay. And silence. Dead, oppressive, almost palpable silence, broken only by the mournful rustling of the wind in the bare, weeping branches of the coastal willows and the rare, anxious cry of some invisible marsh bird, like the cry of a lost child. Where to look here? The swamp seemed endless, stretching beyond the horizon, and the thought of finding a single flower, even a magical one, in this vast expanse seemed completely insane. Anechka gathered all her willpower and, trying not to think about the fear creeping up on her, stepped cautiously, as if treading on thin ice, onto the first mound she came across, poking it first with a long stick she had picked up on the shore. The hummock, covered with slippery moss, swayed slightly under her weight, and a quiet squelching sound came from beneath it. But fortunately, it held. Catching her breath, she jumped to the next one, then to another, slightly smaller and less stable. Slowly, with the utmost caution, moving from mound to mound, balancing like a skilled tightrope walker and risking falling into the foul-smelling sludge at every moment, the girl began to advance deeper into the accursed swamp. Her heart was beating so hard and loudly in her little chest that it seemed as if it would jump out and run away like a frightened rabbit. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, what this mysterious sunflower, which her grandmother had spoken of so vaguely, looked like, but some unknown, almost mystical inner force, born of despair and last hope, drew her forward into the very heart of the quagmire. And suddenly, when she had almost lost all hope and was ready to turn back, on a small island slightly raised above the water, covered with thick, bright green moss, a little away from the main chain of mounds along which she was moving, she saw it, or what, in her excited state, she took for it. A bright, dazzling yellow, almost golden spot amid the dreary, gray-brown vegetation. It seemed to glow from within with an unearthly, beckoning light, drawing the eye, hypnotizing, promising a miracle and the fulfillment of all desires. "There it is. I found it," whispered Anya with parched lips, not believing her eyes, afraid that it was just an optical illusion, a mirage created by her feverish imagination. A sunflower. Forgetting in an instant all caution, the treachery of the marshy swamp, the scary stories of the village old women, she, blinded by this vision, took a careless, wide step toward the coveted island. But her foot did not find the expected firm support. Instead, with a quiet, sucking sound, she sank ankle-deep into the cold, sticky, tar-like swamp mud. Anechka cried out in fright, more from surprise than from pain, and instinctively tried to pull out her stuck leg, but the treacherous quicksand held her in a death grip, like someone's invisible but strong hand. She made another awkward, panicked movement, trying to lean on her other leg, but it too slipped treacherously off the mound and sank into the mire. Now she was knee-deep in the icy swamp, and with every second, with every desperate movement, she was sucked deeper and deeper. Terror, icy and paralyzing, gripped her entire body, from the tips of her fingers to the roots of her hair. She realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that she was in a deadly trap from which she could not escape on her own. "Help!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, but her voice, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, sounded surprisingly weak and pitiful, like a kitten's squeak. "Someone, save me, help!" But all around her was the same silent, indifferent, lifeless wasteland. The swamp slowly, inexorably, with some sinister methodicalness, pulled her down into its cold, dark depths. The foul-smelling sludge had already reached her waist, squeezing her insides and making her nauseous. Anechka was suffocating from the growing fear and despair. With her last ounce of strength, she clung with her thin, trembling fingers to the sparse, slippery blades of grass and the stunted stems of marsh plants. But they broke easily in her weakened hands, offering no support. Hot tears streamed down her pale, mud-stained cheeks, mixing with the marsh mud and her own sweat. Was this really the end? It was so stupid, so scary, so unfair to die here in this cold, soulless swamp, far from people, forgotten by everyone, unwanted by anyone. She remembered her mother's face again, her kind, forgiving smile, and a new, even stronger wave of despair overwhelmed her. No, she didn't want to die. She wanted so much to live. But the swamp was stronger than her childish desire. It had already reached her chest, squeezing her lungs, preventing her from breathing, forcing out the last of the air. Anya coughed convulsively, choking on dirty water. With her last ounce of strength, she raised her head, trying to keep it above the surface, and closed her eyes, mentally saying goodbye to life, to the sun she loved so much, to the distant, high sky, which she could hardly see anymore because of the approaching darkness. At that very desperate moment, when Anya's last strength was almost gone, and she, exhausted from her futile struggle, had already stopped resisting, preparing to accept her terrible, inevitable fate. A huge gray shadow emerged from the thick, intertwined thickets of black alder and weeping willows that grew like a gloomy wall at the very edge of the swamp, absolutely silently, like a ghost. The girl, already almost immersed in a saving oblivion, with incredible effort opened her eyelashes, stuck together with mud, and froze, unable even to cry out from the new, even more terrible horror that gripped her heart like an icy hoop. It was him. Gray, the very same wolf, the terror of the whole neighborhood. The legendary forest bandit, about whom the villagers whispered with horror, attributing to him all the recent disappearances of livestock and even more terrible bloody deeds that made the blood freeze in the veins of even the bravest men. He stood just a few steps away from her, on relatively firm ground, in a small clearing between the bushes, staring intently at her with his huge, piercing yellow eyes that seemed to burn with some kind of inner fire. Anechka saw him so close for the first time in her life, and he seemed even bigger and more terrifying than in the stories told by the village hunters. It was a large, mature, incredibly thin, but still powerful beast, with a lean, muscular body, powerful, widely spaced paws, and thick, matted, patchy fur of an indeterminate gray-brown color, covered with old scars and fresh scratches. Its large, pointed ears were pricked alertly against its skull, and long, sharp, dagger-like yellowish fangs were visible through its slightly open, bared mouth. Well, that's it, thought Anya with a strange, detached calm that sometimes comes before the face of imminent death. Now it will pounce. Easy, defenseless prey. It doesn't even need to chase her. She's fallen right into the trap. She closed her eyes again, waiting for the final, deadly bite. The lunge that would end her miserable, useless life. The seconds dragged on like long, agonizing hours. But nothing happened. No menacing growl, no clicking of teeth, no sensation of sharp claws on her body. Only oppressive silence, broken by her own ragged, hoarse breathing and the quiet, disgusting slurping of the quicksand, which continued to slowly but surely suck her deeper and deeper. Anechka, not believing her luck or, on the contrary, fearing an even more terrible outcome, risked opening her eyes again. The wolf did not move. He was still standing at the edge of the bog, staring intently at her. There was no trace of malice in his intelligent, attentive eyes, nor the hungry, predatory gleam she had feared so much. Rather, there was something more like extreme bewilderment, or even intense, almost scientific curiosity. He tilted his large, broad head slightly to one side, as if trying to get a better look and understand what strange, two-legged creature was desperately floundering in this dirty, foul-smelling sludge, making such pitiful sounds. Then, slowly, with some kind of animal grace, he walked around her along the very edge of the swamp, not approaching her, but not leaving either, sniffing the ground carefully, as if studying her tracks. Anya, frozen with a mixture of fear and incomprehension, watched his every move, afraid to even move. What did he want from her? Why didn't he attack her if he was such a bloodthirsty predator, as they said? Maybe he was just waiting for her to get completely stuck, exhausted, so that then, without any risk to himself, thoughts swirled in her foggy head, breaking off and replacing each other with kaleidoscopic speed. The swampy sludge had already reached her fragile shoulders, the icy cold penetrating to her bones, causing uncontrollable shivering throughout her body. It was becoming harder and harder to breathe, each breath coming with incredible effort. The wolf circled around the spot where Anya was drowning, then stopped directly in front of her, only 3 or 4 meters away, so close that she could have touched him with her outstretched hand if she had had the strength. He sniffed again, noisily drawing in the damp, muddy air through his nostrils, and quickly waved his black, wet nose from side to side several times, as if trying to catch some barely discernible scent. Then he took a few more cautious steps along the edge of the marshy quagmire, carefully examining every bush and every bump, as if looking for something or someone. Despite her panic, Anya couldn't help but notice how strong and graceful he was. Tight, steely muscles rolled under his thick gray fur. Yes, the beast was incredibly strong and, without a doubt, very dangerous. You could feel it in his every measured, smooth movement, in his alert posture, in his piercing, unblinking gaze. But now its behavior was completely unpredictable, utterly incomprehensible, and did not fit into any framework of what she knew about wolves from the stories of the villagers. It showed no signs of aggression, did not growl, did not bare its teeth, did not make threatening lunges. On the contrary, in his intelligent, amber-colored eyes, Anya thought she saw something strange for a moment, something like anxiety, or even sympathy. He whimpered softly, almost silently, briefly, jerkily, as if complaining about something, and again stared intently at the drowning girl. Then he lowered his heavy muzzle to the ground and began to sniff carefully at the withered, last year's grass, dry leaves, and damp moss, as if trying to find some lost trail or searching for the solution to some complex problem known only to him. Anechka could hardly feel her body anymore. Only the cold piercing her to the bone, the unbearable pressure on her chest, and a dull, aching pain in all her joints. Her consciousness began to slowly but surely cloud over, like water in a swampy puddle when stirred. She saw the wolf as if through a thick, whitish veil of fog or through fogged-up glass. Suddenly, Gray raised his head sharply, his ears pricked up. He noticed a thick, dry branch lying nearby, at the very roots of an old, gnarled willow tree. A piece of wood that looked quite sturdy, probably broken off by a recent storm. The wolf slowly approached the branch, sniffed it carefully from all sides, then cautiously but firmly took one end between his teeth and, with visible effort, tried to drag it closer to Anichka. The branch was quite heavy and awkward, catching on the uneven ground, roots, and stones. But the beast stubbornly, with some kind of inhuman obstinacy, pulled it, digging all four paws into the loose soil and growling with the strain. Finally, he managed to drag her to the very edge of the marsh, and working with his muzzle and front paws, he tried to push her as far as possible toward the girl so that she could grab hold of her. But, alas, the branch was too short. Even if Anya still had the strength and coordination to move, she would not have been able to reach it. She was already too deep in the quagmire, and with every passing second, the bog was pulling her lower and lower. The wolf seemed to understand this. He threw the branch away in frustration, and it fell to the ground with a dull thud. He whimpered again, this time louder, more plaintively, almost humanly. He rushed anxiously, almost in panic, along the narrow strip of shore, his anxious gaze shifting from the girl, who was almost completely submerged in the swamp, to the thick forest where, as he apparently knew, a path led to a distant village. His intelligent eyes now clearly showed despair and some kind of animal longing. It seemed that he perfectly understood the hopelessness and tragedy of the situation. But at the same time, he categorically refused to give up, did not want to accept the inevitable. Anya could no longer speak, only moaning quietly and intermittently, each moan echoing with pain in her constricted chest. She saw the wolf rushing along the shore, and in her fading, confused mind, a completely crazy, incredible, almost delirious thought flashed. Could he really want to help her? A wild, bloodthirsty beast that everyone in the village feared and hated, that they considered a spawn of hell? It was too incredible, too fantastic to be true. It must be death throes, feverish hallucinations, she thought, and a bitter smile touched her blue lips. Sergei suddenly froze in the middle of his desperate rush along the shore. He raised his broad head high, his nostrils quivering as they caught some invisible currents of air, his ears pricked up, turning in different directions like radar, trying to catch the slightest sound in the seemingly absolute silence. He crouched down, tensing like a coiled spring. Then, with a short, sharp, guttural roar, like a command or a battle cry, he spun around and, swift as an arrow shot from a bow, rushed away from the swamp, toward the dark wall of the forest, where his animal instincts told him a human village must be. Anechka, who had almost lost touch with reality, watched him go with a foggy, expressionless gaze. So he left after all. He ran away. Perhaps he finally realized that there was nothing for him here. No prey. Or maybe he was frightened by something that only he could smell or hear. The last, weakest, most incredible spark of hope, which by some miracle had managed to flicker in her tormented soul at the sight of the wolf's strange, illogical behavior, finally died out, leaving behind only the cold ashes of despair. Now it was definitely over. The end. She was left alone, completely alone, alone with her slow, painful death in this icy, foul-smelling swamp. Cold, thick water was already reaching her chin, threatening to overwhelm her face. Anya took one last convulsive, ragged breath, and consciousness began to rapidly leave her, taking with it the pain, fear, and the last remnants of her will to live. She could hardly feel the piercing cold or the oppressive weight on her chest anymore. Only an all-consuming, immeasurable fatigue, and a kind of dull, detached indifference to everything that was happening. Bright, iridescent spots floated before her closed eyes, and distant, indistinct voices, similar to her mother's lullaby, rang in her ears. She slowly but inevitably sank into the silence that had fallen upon her and the darkness that was closing in on her from all sides. Meanwhile, the wolf, unaware of his paws beneath him, rushed through the dense, gloomy forest, not caring about the path, not paying attention to the thorny branches that lashed his muzzle and sides. He leapt over fallen, moss-covered tree trunks and tore through thick, impenetrable thickets of young hazel and blackthorn, leaving patches of his gray fur behind. He ran as fast as he had probably never run in his life, even when fleeing from hunters or pursuing prey. His powerful, sinewy paws barely touched the damp ground covered with rotten leaves. He knew, instinctively felt, that he had very, very little time. Some unknown instinct, as ancient as life itself, stronger than hunger, stronger than fear, stronger even than the instinct for self-preservation, drove him forward. He did not understand why he was doing this, why the fate of this small, defenseless human child had suddenly become so important to him, more important than his own safety. But he felt with every fiber of his being that he had to, that he simply had to make it in time. He had to bring help somehow, even though he had no idea how to do it. Or whether those who had always seen him as an arch-enemy, a bloodthirsty predator to be destroyed immediately, would respond to his desperate call. But he ran, pushing himself to the very limits of his physical strength, his huge heart pounding wildly in his chest like a trapped bird, and an incomprehensible burning fire raged in his lungs, making him forget his fatigue, the pain in his aching muscles, his own safety, everything in the world except that small figure drowning in the swamp. The wolf, breathing heavily and sticking out his tongue, flew out to the edge of the forest, where the first houses of the village, crooked with age and shrouded in wisps of gray smoke, were already visible. He stopped abruptly for a moment, looked around, trembling with tension and exhaustion, thick white steam escaping from his heated mouth. Then he raised his heavy head high and howled. It was not the long, mournful, almost musical howl with which wolves usually call to each other in the silence of the night, informing their kin of their whereabouts or lamenting their wolfish fate. No, it was a completely different sound, loud, alarming, almost hysterical, a call full of some kind of primitive despair animal anguish, and an inexplicable, almost human plea. He howled so that everyone would hear him, so that they would understand. There, in the forest, a terrible misfortune had happened, and someone needed help. From the nearest hut, blackened by time, Ignat Krivoy, the hunter who had shouted the loudest about the need to catch Siri and who had boasted more than once that he would personally put a bullet between his eyes, came out, creaking the low door. Hearing the wolf's howl so close to the village and in broad daylight, he immediately became alert, his hand instinctively reaching for the old but trusty rifle hanging on the wall of the hallway. "Like you forest vermin, devil's spawn," he growled through clenched teeth, his only good eye flashing menacingly. "You must be completely emboldened by hunger and impunity, coming so close to human dwellings. You're looking for your death." Attracted by his angry cries and the incessant howling of wolves, several more men from neighboring houses poured into the street, armed with whatever they could find, some with old pitchforks with broken prongs, others with heavy carpenter's axes, and still others with simple clubs. They saw Gray standing at the very edge of the forest, by an old, lonely birch tree, continuing to howl desperately and tearfully, staring intently in their direction. "Well, now you're going to get what's coming to you, you damned bandit," shouted one of the men, the youngest and most impetuous, named Stepan, threateningly swinging his pitchfork. The wolf, seeing the people approaching him and their clearly hostile intentions, surprisingly did not run away, as wild animals usually did when they saw a human. Instead, it took a few uncertain steps toward them, then suddenly darted off toward the forest, howled desperately again, and looked back at them expectantly, as if inviting them to follow. Then he ran closer again, almost to the feet of the stunned men, and barked several times in short, sharp bursts, as village dogs usually do when trying to draw their master's attention to something important. Such behavior was completely uncharacteristic of a wild, experienced wolf, known to all as a cunning and cautious beast. The men froze for a moment in bewilderment, not knowing what to think. "What's wrong with him?" muttered one of them, glancing fearfully at the strange beast. "Has he gone mad from hunger?" "He's not mad," Ignat spat angrily, raising his old rifle. "He's being cunning, the gray bastard. He wants to lure us into the thicket, where his whole pack is waiting in ambush." He quickly but carefully aimed at the large gray carcass. The gray wolf, as if realizing that they did not understand him, that they did not believe him, that his intentions were being misinterpreted, made one last desperate attempt to get through to these uncomprehending, aggressive people. He ran up almost to Ignat, who already had his finger on the trigger, and with lightning speed, but surprisingly delicately, grabbed the very edge of his worn sheepskin coat with his teeth and pulled him gently but persistently toward the forest, continuing to whine plaintively and glance imploringly at Ignat and the other men with his intelligent eyes full of some kind of animal anguish. This was the last thing he managed to do in his short but tragically cut short life. A deafening, dry crack of a gunshot shattered the tense silence of the autumn day, echoing through the forest and causing a flock of crows to take flight from the nearest trees with a cawing cry. Ignat, deciding at the last moment that the wolf, emboldened to the extreme, was about to pounce on him, instinctively pulled the trigger of his old but still deadly rifle. The heavy lead bullet, intended for large game, struck Gray in the left side, just below the shoulder blade, with a dull, squelching sound, piercing the thick fur and entering deep into the body. The wolf let out a piercing, dog-like yelp of unbearable pain, released the edge of Ignat's sheepskin coat from its mouth, and staggered back a few steps, leaving on the withered, frost-covered grass, or on a thin layer of the first, not yet melted snow, if the action takes place a little later in the fall, quickly spreading dark red, almost black drops of hot blood. But even mortally wounded, He did not try to hide in the thicket or, on the contrary, rush at his attackers in a rage as any other wild animal would have done in his place. Instead, staggering heavily from side to side and whimpering pitifully, intermittently from the pain piercing him, he staggered, almost crawled, with his last incredible strength toward the black swamp darkening in the distance, glancing back painfully at the people frozen in amazement, as if begging them with his last breath to follow him. With every passing second, his movements became slower and more uncertain. Blood flowed more profusely from his wound, staining his gray fur crimson. But he stubbornly, with some kind of fanatical persistence, moved forward, driven by some incredible force of will beyond human comprehension. The men, stunned by the beast's completely unexpected behavior and the sudden, almost accidental outcome of the hunt they had not really intended to go on, stood in complete confusion, not knowing what to do. "What is it doing?" whispered one of them in a strained voice, not taking his eyes off the receding, staggering figure of the wolf. "It's mortally wounded, but it's not running away. It's not attacking. Where is it dragging us, damn it?" "I don't know," Ignat replied grimly, almost in a whisper, slowly lowering his smoking rifle. His usually sharp and confident voice now lacked even a trace of his former self-assurance. His scarred face reflected extreme bewilderment and a vague, as yet unformed anxiety. "But something's not right here. Something's very wrong. Come on, men. Let's see where he takes us. We have nothing to lose, and this business is strange." And they, still wary, but no longer with their former aggression and malice, but rather with growing curiosity and inexplicable unease, moved after the bleeding but stubbornly advancing wolf. Gray, staggering and stumbling, dragged himself forward with his last ounce of strength, showing them the way with his bloodied carcass. He walked very slowly, often stopping to catch his ragged, hoarse breath. And then his large body would shake violently. But every time the people approached him, he found some supernatural strength to take a few more painful steps, dragging them deeper and deeper into the gloomy, silent forest, to that very same terrifying black swamp, where, in the icy, sucking quagmire, the small, defenseless life of Ania was slowly but surely fading away. Ignat's heart, usually hard and unfeeling, for some reason tightened unpleasantly with a bad sucking premonition. He knew this forest like the back of his hand, having explored it countless times, and he understood perfectly well where this wounded but stubborn beast was leading them. There, to the most dangerous place in the entire district, from where, according to rumors, few ever returned alive, and where, according to legend, the most terrible and inexplicable things happened. What could have happened there that even a mortally wounded wolf, in its last breath, was trying so desperately to lead them there? What unknown force was forcing it to endure this hellish pain and continue its last, hopeless journey? When Ignat and the other men following close behind him, led by the wolf, which was now almost exhausted, finally made their way through the thick thickets of willow and alder trees and came out into the open space of the gloomy black swamp. A truly terrifying and completely unbelievable sight met their shocked eyes. At the very edge of the treacherous marsh, where there was still a narrow strip of relatively firm, moss-covered ground, lay the huge gray wolf, breathing heavily and intermittently, covered in blood and mud. He was still alive, but it was obvious that his last moments were numbered. With his last incredible strength, he raised his heavy, bloodied head with difficulty, and uttering a quiet, barely audible whimpering sound, similar to a moan, he weakly waved the tip of his tail, pointing his pointed muzzle somewhere toward the dark, motionless surface of the swamp. Only then did the stunned people, following his gaze, see her. A small figure, almost indistinguishable against the gray-brown background of the quagmire, almost completely hidden under a layer of murky, oily, foul-smelling slime. Only a tangled mass of Ania's light hair, matted with mud, floating on the surface, and her thin blue hand, clutching desperately with its last ounce of strength a tuft of withered grass sticking out of the water, were visible above the surface of this deadly swamp. The girl was unconscious. Her little face, smeared with mud, was deathly pale, almost blue from hypothermia, and she seemed to have stopped breathing. "Anechka? Look, men, it's Anya, Marfina's orphan," someone suddenly cried out desperately. It was Stepan, the youngest of the men, who was the first to recognize the unfortunate girl. In an instant, everyone forgot about the wolf, their guns, and their fear of this cursed swamp. The instinct to save a human life proved stronger than all prejudices and fears. Everyone rushed toward her. Without consulting each other, they feverishly, with a kind of desperate haste, began to build a makeshift platform out of dry branches lying nearby and the broken trunks of young, thin trees, which they immediately cut down with their axes in order to somehow reach the drowning child, who was almost completely submerged. Ignat, as the most experienced and seasoned in such matters, took charge of the rescue operation, shouting out terse commands and encouraging the others. One of the men, the quickest, was already running back to the village for ropes, warm sheepskin coats, and possibly help. The work was in full swing. Each of them, even the most hardened and indifferent, understood that every second counted and that any delay could cost the girl her life. Finally, with great difficulty, risking every second of falling into the treacherous mire themselves, they managed to drag Anya's fragile, limp body to the very edge of the swamp, and with incredible effort, pull her onto relatively solid ground. She was unconscious, cold to the touch, like a piece of ice, and seemed to be completely unconscious. She was immediately wrapped in warm sheepskin coats brought by someone, and they began to vigorously rub her frozen, lifeless arms and legs, trying to restore blood circulation. At that very moment, when Anya was finally pulled out of the deadly embrace of the swamp, Sergei, who was lying nearby and had been watching everything that was happening with his already clouding, weakening eyes, let out a quiet, long, deep sigh, as if he were breathing a sigh of incredible relief or a sense of duty fulfilled. And his large, lumpy head fell limply, as if cut down, onto the damp, cold ground. He was no longer breathing. He had died. He had fulfilled his last duty, which no one fully understood, his incredible, almost fantastical mission, and left this world quietly, unnoticed, without suffering, like a shadow dissolving into the gathering autumn twilight. The men, completely absorbed in saving the girl, did not immediately notice his quiet death. Only when the first, most acute fear for Anya's life had passed, and her weak, intermittent breathing became slightly smoother and deeper, did Ignat, breathing heavily from the tension and excitement he had experienced, turn to the motionless wolf. Anechka slowly, with great difficulty, returned from the dark, cold nothingness. She was carefully carried, trying not to shake her, to the nearest hut, warm and clean, belonging to the compassionate widow, Agafia. They rubbed her numb body first with snow, then with rough cloth soaked in vodka, wrapped her in several dry, warm sheepskins, laid her on a hot Russian stove, and began to pour hot, fragrant decoction of medicinal herbs with honey into her mouth, drop by drop. The first thing she saw when she struggled to open her heavy eyelids were the anxious, sympathetic faces of women leaning over her and the stern, usually inscrutable. But now somewhat confused and even guilty face of Ignat Krivoy, standing a little apart near the door. "The wolf," she whispered barely audibly, her blue, cracked lips trembling with weakness and the horror she had experienced. Where is the wolf?" "He's gone, girl," replied the widow Agafia quietly, trying not to frighten her, stroking her tangled, still damp hair gently. "He died, poor thing. Our Ignat. That—" She didn't finish, stopping mid-sentence when she caught the hunter's heavy, pleading gaze. He didn't attack me," Anya said suddenly, loudly and clearly, and her weak, childish voice took on an incomprehensible adult strength and conviction. He wanted to help me. I saw him. He was standing by the swamp, howling pitifully, as if calling someone. Then he ran off somewhere, toward the village, and then he brought you. I remember everything." Hot tears rolled uncontrollably down her pale, emaciated cheeks. But these were no longer tears of panic or despair, but tears of a new pain, still incomprehensible to her, mixed with boundless pity for the dead animal. She told the story, often breaking off, stumbling over her words, choking with emotion. How the wolf had not touched her when she was completely defenseless. How he had tried to push a branch toward her to save her. How he had howled desperately, almost humanly. How it howled, looking toward the distant village. How it suddenly disappeared, leaving her alone. And how, after what seemed like an eternity, people appeared and rescued her. The men crowded around the door of the hut and peered through the windows, listening to her broken, confused story with bated breath. Their faces growing darker and darker with each passing minute, their eyes dropping lower and lower. Ignat Krivoy stood as pale as a freshly whitewashed wall, his strong hands, accustomed to hard work, trembling uncontrollably. He bowed his head low, unable to bear the pure, innocent gaze of the rescued girl. Slowly but surely, like an approaching storm, the terrible, unimaginable, almost fantastical truth dawned on everyone there in the black swamp who had heard the child's simple but sincere story. The wolf, Gray, whom they all, without exception, considered a bloodthirsty killer, a spawn of hell, a wild, untamed beast whom they hunted, feared, and hated with all their hearts, had saved a human child at the cost of his own life. He had not driven her into the swamp, as they had initially thought in their panic. He found her there, already drowning, already almost dead, and with the only means available to him, an animal, he tried to call for help with his desperate, anxious howl. And when his howls had no effect, he risked his own life and ran to the village, to his sworn enemies. And despite the mortal wounds they inflicted on him, he dragged them to the scene of the tragedy with his last ounce of strength. They did not kill a predator or an enemy. They killed a hero. They killed a savior. Such a simple and terrible realization had never before been experienced by their harsh, life-hardened souls. In the spacious, hotly heated hut of the widow Agafia, where the rescued Anya lay wrapped in sheepskins on a wide Russian stove, a heavy, oppressive, almost palpable silence reigned. All that could be heard was the girl's faint, intermittent breathing and the peaceful crackling of dry birch logs in the fiery mouth of the stove. The men, who stood in a dense crowd at the entrance and peered through the small windows covered with cowhide, silently, one by one, took off their worn Ushanka hats and caps. The women, listening to Anya's confused but convincing story, no longer hiding, furtively wiped away the tears that had welled up in their eyes with the corners of their headscarves. One of them, the most sensitive old Matrona, unable to bear it any longer, quietly sobbed in an old woman's voice. This single sob, like a spark falling on dry moss, was taken up by others, and soon the whole hut was filled with quiet, restrained, but no less bitter weeping. These were tears of boundless pity for the poor, long-suffering orphan, who had nearly perished through the fault of her cruel, heartless aunt and her own childhood despair. These were tears of burning, unbearable shame for their blind, animal hatred, for their hastiness and prejudice, with which they so easily condemned and sentenced to death a living, thinking creature, without even trying to understand its motives, its strange behavior that did not fit into the usual framework. These were tears of silent admiration for this incredible act of self-sacrifice, incomprehensible to the human mind, performed by a wild forest animal who, at the most critical moment, proved to be immeasurably more humane, noble, and merciful than many of those who called themselves human beings. Ignat Krivoy stood as if struck by lightning, like a petrified statue. The rifle, which he had been clutching mechanically, unconsciously, in his numb hands, suddenly slipped from his weakened fingers and hit the unpainted wooden floor with a dull, heavy thud. He wanted to say something, perhaps try to justify himself, explain his actions, but the words stuck in his throat, unable to find a way out. And what was the point of words now? He, Ignat, an experienced, seasoned hunter who considered himself an unrivaled expert on the forest and all its inhabitants, had made the most terrible, most unforgivable mistake in his long and not always righteous life. He had killed the one who had saved him. He had killed an innocent man. At that very moment, when the tension in the hut reached its peak, Aunt Marfa, attracted by the unusual noise, crying, and general commotion, pushed her way through the crowd, elbowing people aside, and tried to squeeze in unceremoniously. "What's all this commotion? And you ungrateful wretch," she hissed in her shrill voice, glancing maliciously at the pale, barely alive Anya. "Where have you been wandering around, you good-for-nothing? You didn't bring any berries, of course, but you could have at least gathered a bundle of firewood for the stove, you lazy good-for-nothing." But no one listened to her. They looked at her with such cold, undisguised contempt and deaf, barely restrained condemnation that she stopped mid-sentence, feeling the icy chill emanating from those around her. Her malicious little eyes darted fearfully from side to side, and she instinctively shuddered as if from a sudden blow and backed away toward the exit, muttering something unintelligible under her breath. Her time in this village, and perhaps in this world, was up. No one would offer her a helping hand. No one would share a piece of bread with her. No one would say a kind word to her. She had become an outcast, a pariah, and that was perhaps worse than any other punishment, even the most severe. The crying in the hut did not subside. It spread like a forest fire to the street and throughout the village. It seemed as if the whole neighborhood was crying, not loudly, not tearfully, not ostentatiously, but quietly, mournfully, almost silently, mourning not only the innocent wolf that had died, but also something very important that had been irretrievably lost within themselves. The remnants of their faith in justice, the crumbs of kindness, the ability to see with the heart, not just with the eyes. News of the incredible incident in the Black Marsh and the tragic but heroic death of the gray wolf spread throughout the district with the speed of a steppe fire driven by a strong wind. People from neighboring villages, even the most distant ones, dropped everything and came to see the rescued girl with their own eyes, to hear the details of this incredible story firsthand, and perhaps to look at the place where this amazing beast had died. And everyone who heard this story, whether old or young, man or woman, could not hold back their tears, or at least a heavy, mournful sigh. Sari's body, covered with an old mat hastily thrown over it, remained lying at the very edge of the swamp, where he had breathed his last breath. None of the village men dared to touch him, remove him, or bury him. He lay there, huge and motionless, as if silently but menacingly reproaching the entire human race for its cruelty, its blindness, and its ingratitude. Only late in the evening, when the village, exhausted by the events of the past day, finally fell silent, sinking into a restless, troubled sleep, Ignat Krevoy took a shovel and a heavy pickaxe from the barn and, alone, trying to remain unnoticed, made his way along the familiar path to the black swamp. He simply didn't have the right to leave him there to be eaten by wild animals and birds. He had to at least somehow atone for his terrible, irreparable guilt. Even though deep down he knew perfectly well that nothing could ever atone for it, under the cold, indifferent light of the full moon, which shone especially brightly today, as if wanting to illuminate the scene of the tragedy, in absolute, ringing silence, broken only by the mournful rustling of the reeds on the shore and the rare, anxious cries of some night marsh birds. Ignat dug a shallow but wide grave for a long time, in silence on a small dry hillock at the very edge of the forest, where the ground was harder and not so saturated with marsh moisture. Then carefully, almost tenderly, which no one expected of him, he carried the lifeless, already stiffening body of the wolf in his strong arms, laid it gently in the dug hole, trying to give it a more natural, peaceful position, and slowly, without haste, covered it with damp, cold earth. He did not place a cross or a stone over the animal's grave. Why? God, if he exists, sees everything. And the memory of Gray will now live not in cold stone or roughly hewn wood, but in the warm, trembling hearts of people who will never forget his deed. After she had recovered a little and regained her strength, Anya was taken into the home of the childless but very kind and wealthy family of the village elder, Matvey Ivanovich. They surrounded her with such sincere care, such genuine love, and such attention that she had not known since the cruel disease took the lives of her beloved parents. The girl slowly but surely recovered physically, but the horror she had experienced in the swamp and the unforgettable image of the huge gray wolf that had saved her at the cost of its own life remained forever in her childish but already mature soul. She often sneaked away from her new guardians and went to the edge of the forest, to that nameless grave lost among the trees, and brought modest wildflowers, daisies, cornflowers, and bluebells that she had picked in the meadow. Aunt Marfa was driven out of the village by the collective, silent but no less effective contempt of the villagers. No one wanted anything to do with her anymore. No one spoke to her. No one responded to her greetings. Unable to bear this universal ostracism, one night she gathered her few, pitiful belongings into a bundle and, as quietly as a thief, left for parts unknown, accompanied only by the contemptuous glances of the few who happened to see her departure. Ignat Krevoy changed greatly after that terrible incident in the swamp. He seemed to age overnight, becoming gaunt and hunched over. He almost stopped hunting, threw his rifle into the farthest corner of the shed, and became silent, sullen, and withdrawn. He was often seen wandering alone in the forest, but no longer with his gun at the ready, but with his head bowed, as if he had lost something in the forest and now could not find it, or as if he was trying to talk to someone invisible, to ask for forgiveness. People in the village said that he never forgave himself for that fatal mistake, for the unforgivable death of Sari. Years passed, carrying away sorrows and joys, leaving only the most vivid and significant events in people's memories. Anya grew up, transforming from a frightened, thin orphan into a beautiful, stately, and very kind girl with a clear, radiant gaze and a soft, shy smile. She married a hard-working and honest young man from a neighboring village whom she loved with all her heart, and soon gave birth to a healthy, strong son, and then two lovely twin daughters. Her life finally settled down and became peaceful and happy. But every time she came to her small homeland, to her native village, to visit the graves of her parents and adoptive parents who loved her like their own daughter, she would first, secretly from everyone, go to the edge of the forest, to that very sacred place where, according to her childhood memories, her savior, the gray wolf. The grave had long since been overgrown with thick grass and small bushes, leveled with the ground, and only she, and perhaps old Ignat, if he was still alive, knew that it was here, under the canopy of mighty pines and firs, that the ashes of the one who had once given her a second life rested. The story of the poor orphan girl who nearly died in the treacherous quagmire of the Black Swamp, and of the mysterious, noble wolf who sacrificed his own life to bring her to safety, gradually became a local legend, a kind of parable. It was told by wise old men to their curious grandchildren on long winter evenings, sitting by a hot stove. And every time the story reached the tragic death of Gray, tears would involuntarily well up in the eyes of the listeners, even the youngest ones. It seemed as if the whole neighborhood was crying again and again, remembering this sad but at the same time bright story. Crying about the immeasurable human cruelty and unforgivable blindness, about the treachery and injustice of fate, but also about the great, incomprehensible, almost holy heart of a wild forest beast, which proved capable of such incredible self-sacrifice. The Black Swamp remained a sinister, forbidden place for the locals, which they tried to avoid. But now this primitive fear was mixed with something completely different. Deep respect, quiet sorrow, and some kind of inexplicable, bright sadness. The people, taught by the bitter experience of their ancestors, became noticeably more careful and attentive to the forest and all its numerous inhabitants, large and small, as if subconsciously afraid of repeating the terrible, irreparable mistake that the hunter Ignat had once made. The old-timers said that since then, wolves had become much less likely to approach human dwellings in these parts, as if they too remembered the tragic fate of their fellow wolf, Gray, and did not want to tempt fate or test human patience unnecessarily. And in that very place, on a small hill at the edge of the forest, where Ignat had once secretly buried his unwitting savior, every spring, as soon as the snow melted and the earth warmed up under the first rays of the April sun, a single but unusually large and bright flower bloomed among the young emerald grass, resembling a small shining sun or a drop of frozen gold. No one knew where it came from, because nothing like it had ever grown there before. But people who knew the legend of Sari called it Wolf's Heart or Sari's Sunflower, with reverence and tenderness. And this modest but symbolic forest flower was perhaps the best and most worthy monument to the one who, with his incredible, almost human, and perhaps even superhuman deed, had once made the whole neighborhood weep with remorse and admiration, and forever changed the life of a small village lost among endless forests and swamps. The legend lived on, carefully passed down from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation, like the most precious treasure, constantly reminding people that true kindness and genuine self-sacrifice can be found where you least expect them, and that the most terrifying and dangerous beast is not always the one that walks on four powerful legs and bares its sharp teeth menacingly from the dark forest thicket. Sometimes, and even too often, it lives among us, humans, And its name is callous indifference, blind hatred, and rigid, life-destroying prejudices. Ignat Krivoy lived to a very old age, almost biblical. But the heavy, black shadow of that fateful, memorable day in the Black Swamp never left his wounded soul. He became a kind of local hermit, almost a recluse, rarely appearing in the village, where he was met with mixed feelings: pity, respect, and some inexplicable fear. He spent most of his time in the forest, in a small hut on stilts that he had built himself. But no longer with his trusty rifle on his shoulder, as in former years, but simply silently observing the life of nature hidden from prying eyes, the habits of animals and birds. The old-timers whispered that he had learned to understand the language of the forest dwellers, and that the wolves, which were still numerous in those parts, sometimes approached his forest hut, but never touched him or harmed him, as if they knew of his deep, sincere remorse and the invisible bond that forever connected him to their fallen comrade. He often, especially in the spring, when that very cherished flower bloomed, sat for a long time on an old stump near the place where, long ago, under cover of night, he had buried Gray, and for hours he would stare motionless at this lonely but life-affirming yellow flame, as if conducting a silent dialogue with someone invisible, understandable only to him. No one knew what was going on in his soul during those long hours of silent contemplation, nor did anyone try to find out. But with each passing spring, the wrinkles on his emaciated, parchment-like face became deeper and more pronounced, and his eyes, once sharp and predatory, looked at the world with a kind of universal, inexorable sadness. The village where these tragic and at the same time miraculous events took place also gradually changed. The people, shaken to the core by the story of the gray wolf, became somehow gentler, more attentive and tolerant of each other, kinder to the world around them. The story of the gray wolf became for them not just a beautiful legend, but an important life lesson that they learned for the rest of their lives. They learned from their own bitter experience how easy it is to make mistakes, to give in to herd mentality or blind rage, how easy it is to condemn and destroy an innocent person, and how painfully difficult and sometimes impossible it is to right the wrongs you have done. And every time one of the old people, especially in the presence of young people, began to talk about Sari, tears involuntarily welled up in the eyes of the listeners, tears of deep purification, tears of belated repentance, tears of boundless gratitude to the one who, through his unimaginable feat, showed them the true value of human and not only human life, the true beauty of self-sacrifice. Anechka, who by that time had become not only a mother, but also a grandmother, often told this moving story to her numerous grandchildren as the most important and instructive bedtime story, as an ancient parable about the eternal struggle between good and evil, about true courage and shameful cowardice, about all-consuming love and blind, destructive hatred. And her children listened, holding their breath, their clear, astonished eyes wide open, and in their pure, unspoiled hearts, a vague but true understanding began to dawn, that the world was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance, that it was not so easily divided into black and white, that even in the most terrifying, seemingly wild beast, a passionate, noble heart could beat, and in the most ordinary, unremarkable person, a bottomless abyss of cruelty and indifference could lurk. And these little listeners, unbeknownst to themselves, learned to look at the world around them not only with their eyes, which so often deceive, but also with their hearts, which are rarely wrong, just as, perhaps, the poor, misunderstood, but great gray wolf once looked at the defenseless girl drowning in the swamp, whose tragic death once made the whole neighborhood weep with grief and shame. Misunderstood, but so great in his last burst of energy, whose tragic death once made the whole neighborhood cry with grief and shame, and forever changed for the better the life of a small village lost among the endless Russian forests and swampy marshes. The memory of him lived on. And that was the most important, the most significant outcome of this sad but bright story. Not just years passed, decades flew by. The village where this drama once unfolded grew noticeably, was renovated, and changed beyond recognition. But the legend of the gray wolf savior, as ancient as the forest itself, continued to live in people's hearts, never fading or being forgotten. It was told to the great-great-grandchildren of those who were direct witnesses or participants in those long-ago, almost epic events. The place on the edge of the ominous black swamp, where the noble wolf was killed by human hands, and that small, covered with forest strawberries, where the repentant hunter Ignaz secretly buried him, and where every spring, as a symbol of immortal life and eternal memory, a single, dazzlingly bright sunflower bloomed, became a kind of shrine for the local residents, a place of power and worship. People from nearby villages, and even from distant cities, having heard about this amazing story, came here especially to stand in silence at these two memorable places, to think about eternity, the meaning of life, their own actions, and to silently honor the memory of the innocently murdered but not forgotten Savior. And every time one of the local elders began to tell the story of Sari in their presence, quiet, unbidden tears rolled down the cheeks of the listeners. Tears not only of inexpressible grief for a life tragically cut short, but also of some inexplicable bright sadness, a deep belief that even in the darkest, most impenetrable forest of the human soul, a dazzling ray of hope can suddenly shine, and that even the wildest, most unbridled heart is capable of great, all-forgiving love, and the highest, almost divine self-sacrifice. The black swamp still inspired superstitious fear in people who tried to avoid it, especially at dusk. But now this ancient, almost genetic fear was strangely mixed with a deep, reverent awe. It became a symbol for everyone, not only of mortal danger and the treachery of nature, but also of the incredible, almost biblical miracle that had taken place here many, many years ago. Anechka, who lived to a ripe old age, retaining her clear mind and amazing kindness of heart until her last days, came to the place where Sari was supposed to be buried until her very last days, as long as her legs would carry her. She brought with her not only modest wildflowers, but also, out of an old childhood habit, a small piece of freshly baked bread, just as she had once, long ago, in her hungry, orphan childhood, dreamed of sharing her last piece with someone very kind and understanding. She spoke quietly, almost in a whisper, to the invisible wolf, telling him about her long, difficult, but generally happy life, about her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who had already appeared. And it always seemed to her that he could hear her, that he was invisibly present, protecting her and her family from all misfortunes and calamities. And in those rare, precious moments, her old, life-worn but not hardened heart was filled with indescribable warmth, peace, and boundless, all-encompassing gratitude. The district did not forget. The district cried and remembered. Because stories like this are never forgotten. They become an integral part of the soul of the people, their unwritten conscience, their moral compass, pointing the way to the light. And as long as the memory of the poor but great gray wolf lives on in people's hearts, as long as this amazing sunny flower blooms every spring on his nameless grave, lost in the forest, there is hope that people will be a little kinder, a little wiser, and a little more attentive to those around them, whether human or animal, friend or foe. After all, you never know in advance where you will find the real, pure gold of the human soul, and where you will find only the cold, deceptive glitter of false gold plating. Truth, as we know, is often hidden very deeply, and to see it, to distinguish it from lies, you need something much more than just sharp, experienced eyes. You need a responsive, discerning heart, capable of deep compassion, sincere love, and selfless forgiveness. Such a heart, as it turned out, was possessed by the poor, hounded, but unbroken gray wolf.